October 1944, Clark Field, Luzon. We had the skies, and they kept coming anyway. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morrison pressed his palms against the corrugated metal of the operations tent, feeling the vibrations from another wave of P-38 Lightnings thundering overhead. The 49th Fighter Group had been flying combat missions for 67 straight days, and the pilots were starting to show it. Dark circles under bloodshot eyes, hands that trembled slightly when reaching for coffee cups. The 1,000-yard stare that came from watching too many friends spiral down in flames. But the Japanese kept coming. "Sir, we've got another large formation building over Formosa," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called from the radar plot. "Looks like at least 200 aircraft, bearing 180, range 250 miles and closing." Morrison checked his watch. 0847 hours, October 23, 1944. The fourth day of what the intelligence officers were calling Operation Sho-Go, Japan's desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war by throwing everything they had at the American invasion of Leyte. For 3 days straight, waves of Japanese aircraft had been hurling themselves at the American fleet and ground positions. For 3 days straight, Morrison's pilots had been shooting them down by the dozens. The kill board outside the operations tent told the story in stark chalk marks. 267 confirmed kills in 72 hours. The 49th Fighter Group alone had accounted for nearly a quarter of all enemy aircraft destroyed since the operation began. But the cost was mounting. 18 pilots lost, 12 more wounded, and the remainder running on nothing but adrenaline and black coffee. "How many birds can we get up?" Morrison asked his operations officer, Major Pete Sullivan. Sullivan consulted his clipboard, dark sweat stains already spreading across his khaki shirt despite the early hour. 36 P-38s ready for immediate launch. Another 12 will be mission ready within the hour if maintenance can patch the holes in their wings. Morrison nodded grimly. Holes in wings, that was becoming the standard rather than the exception. Every aircraft that returned from combat bore the scars of battle. Bullet holes, cannon strikes, sometimes entire sections of control surface shot away. The ground crews were performing miracles, but even miracles had their limits. "Get me squadron commanders on the horn," Morrison ordered. "We're going up again." The horn blared across Clark Field, sending pilots sprinting toward their aircraft. Captain Tommy Razor Kowalski was already strapping into his P-38 when Morrison reached the flight line. At 23, Kowalski was one of the oldest pilots in the squadron, old in combat years anyway. He'd been flying missions since Guadalcanal, with 19 confirmed kills painted on his Lightning's nose in neat white silhouettes. "How you feeling, Razor?" Morrison called over the roar of warming engines. Kowalski looked up from adjusting his oxygen mask, his face gaunt beneath his flight helmet. "Like I've been chewed up and spit out, sir. But I can still see straight and my hands aren't shaking too bad." He held up one gloved hand to demonstrate. Only the slightest tremor. "That's good now to kill Japs." Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. "That's what I like to hear. Stay sharp up there." The 36 Lightnings lifted off in perfect formation, their twin Allison engines drawling a deep-throated harmony across the Philippine sky. Morrison took point in his own aircraft, call sign Reaper 6. With Kowalski's flight of 4 P-38s on his right wing. Below them, the jungle-covered mountains of Luzon stretched endlessly toward the horizon, broken only by the occasional rice paddy or village. It looked peaceful from 10,000 feet. The war seemed very far away. That illusion lasted exactly 17 minutes. "Bandits, bandits." The call crackled over the radio from Lieutenant Bobby Chen, Flying Tail, and Charlie in the formation. 40-plus Zeeks and Oscars, Angels 15, coming up from the deck. Morrison craned his neck, scanning the sky below. There, a swarm of dark dots emerging from the haze over Manila Bay, climbing hard toward the American formation. He could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars, their wings glinting in the morning sun. "All Reaper flights. This is Reaper 6. Morrison transmitted, his voice calm despite the surge of adrenaline. "Bandits below at 2 o'clock. We're going down. Stay with your wingman and watch your 6. The P-38s rolled over and dove toward the climbing Japanese formation. The mathematics of aerial combat were brutally simple. Speed, altitude, and position determined who lived and who died. Morrison's Lightnings had all three advantages, at least initially. The Japanese were climbing, burning fuel and energy to reach the Americans' altitude. The P-38s came down like avenging angels, their combined 50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon per aircraft ready to deal death. The two formations merged in a chaos of twisting metal and tracer fire. Morrison selected a zero climbing directly toward him, leading the target just as he'd done hundreds of times before. His finger found the trigger, and the P-38 shuddered as all 5 guns fired in unison. The Zero's canopy exploded in a shower of glass and blood, and the aircraft rolled over and fell toward the jungle below. "Splash one," Morrison called, already looking for his next target. Around him, the sky had dissolved into a swirling dogfight. P-38s and Japanese fighters twisted and turned in deadly spirals, each pilot trying to get behind his opponent long enough to line up a killing shot. The radio chatter was constant, position calls, warnings, victory claims. "Reaper 3, you got a Zeke on your 6. Got him. Oscar going down in flames. Where's my wingman? Tommy, where are you?" "Right here, boss. Just splashed to trying to get on your tail." Morrison pulled hard on the stick, feeling the G-forces press him deep into his seat as he turned inside a Ki-43 that had made the mistake of trying to fight a Lightning. The Japanese pilot was good. Morrison could see him yanking his stick, trying to bring his guns to bear, but the P-38's superior power gave Morrison the advantage. He pulled lead, fired a short burst, and watched the Oscar's engine explode in a gout of flame and oil. Splash 2, another silhouette for the nose arc. The dogfight raged for 20 minutes before the surviving Japanese aircraft broke off and fled toward Manila. Morrison counted his formation as they reformed: 31 P-38s. 5 aircraft lost, including Lieutenant Chen, whose Lightning Morrison had seen take a direct hit from a 20mm cannon. The young pilot hadn't even had time to scream over the radio. But the scoreboard was heavily in their favor. Morrison counted at least 15 Japanese aircraft spiraling down toward the jungle, probably more. The 49th Fighter Group had done its job once again. They were still climbing back to patrol altitude when the next wave appeared. Captain Kowalski's voice crackled over the radio. "Look at that." Morrison looked where Kowalski was pointing and felt his stomach drop. Rising from the south like a plague Ophlocus was another Japanese formation, this one easily twice the size of the first. At least 80 aircraft, Zeros, Oscars, twin-engine Ki-45 Nick fighters, and what looked like a squadron of Ki-84 Frank fighters, Japan's newest and most dangerous interceptor. "All stations, this is Reaper 6, Morrison transmitted. We've got another large formation approaching from the south. Request immediate support from any available flights." The response was immediate, but not encouraging. "Reaper 6, this is Buzzard Leader. We're engaged with a large formation over Subic Bay and cannot assist. You're on their own. 31 tired pilots in shot-up aircraft against 80 fresh Japanese fighters. Morrison did the math and didn't like the result. But there was no choice. Behind them, barely 50 miles away, was the American invasion fleet. Hundreds of ships packed with thousands of soldiers. If the Japanese got through, "All Reaper flights, this is 6, Morrison broadcast. We're going to hit them head-on. Make every shot count and stay with your wingman. We're all that stands between those bastards and our boys on the ships." The two formations met at 20,000 feet over central Luzon. This time there was no advantage of altitude or position, just raw skill and determination pitted against desperate fury. The Japanese came in waves, one squadron after another, trying to overwhelm the smaller American formation through sheer numbers. Morrison found himself locked in a turning fight with a Ki-84 Frank, the most dangerous opponent he'd ever faced. The Japanese pilot was skilled and aggressive, and his aircraft was faster and more maneuverable than anything Morrison had encountered before. For 5 agonizing minutes they spiraled around each other, neither able to gain the advantage, their aircraft groaning under the stress of maximum G-turns. Finally, Morrison managed to extend slightly, using his P-38 as superior acceleration to open just enough distance to reverse his turn. The Japanese pilot, committed to his tight turn, couldn't follow fast enough. Morrison's guns found their mark, and the Frank disintegrated in a ball of fire. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Zero was diving on his wingman, Lieutenant Dave Parks, a 19-year-old from Kansas flying his 15th mission. Morrison tried to warn him, but Parks was too focused on the Oscar he was chasing to hear the radio call. The Zero's guns sparkled, and Parks' P-38 shuddered under the impact of 20mm shells. Morrison watched in horror as Parks's aircraft rolled over and began its final dive. At the last second, he saw the canopy blow away and Parks's parachute blossom white against the green jungle below. Another good man down, another pilot who might not make it back to friendly lines even if he survived the landing. The battle raged on. Morrison's ammunition counter clicked steadily downward as he engaged target after target. Around him, P-38s and Japanese fighters fell from the sky in roughly equal numbers. The radio chatter had devolved into brief, clipped transmissions. "I'm hit. I'm hit. Bail out, Jimmy, bail out. Where's everybody going?" After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the surviving Japanese aircraft again broke off and headed south. Morrison counted his formation. 18 P-38s remained airworthy. 13 aircraft lost in a single engagement, along with pilots he'd known for months or years. But again, the exchange rate favored the Americans. Morrison estimated they'd shot down at least 40 Japanese aircraft, maybe more. The bodies of enemy fighters littered the jungle below like broken toys. "Reaper 6, this is Clark Tower," came the voice of the air traffic controller. "What's your fuel state?" Morrison checked his gauges and cursed under his breath. "Running on fumes, Tower." "Request priority landing for all Reaper flights." "Roger, Reaper 6. You're cleared for immediate approach, all runways. Emergency crews are standing by." The 18 surviving P-38s limped back to Clark Field, their fuel gauges reading empty and their aircraft riddled with bullet holes. Morrison's Lightning had taken hits in both engines, the left one trailing a thin stream of oil that painted a dark line across his canopy. Captain Kowalski's aircraft was even worse off. His right engine was completely dead, and there were holes in his wing large enough to put a fist through. They landed in trail formation, one after another, their tires smoking as they touched down on the pierced steel planking off the runway. Ground crews were already running toward the aircraft before the engines shut down, ready to begin the round-the-clock effort to get as many fighters back in the air as possible. Morrison climbed wearily from his cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the open canopy. His crew chief, Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski, no relation to the pilot, was already examining the battle damage to the Lightning. "How bad is it, Sarge?" Morrison asked. Kowalski whistled low as he peered into the left engine nacelle. "You've got holes in your oil cooler, sir. Probably 20 minutes of flying time left before this thing would have seized up solid." He moved to examine the wing. "And you've got a cannon shell hole right through your aileron control rod. Don't know how you maintained control." Morrison didn't know either. He'd flown hundreds of combat missions, but this morning had been different. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at the Americans, and they weren't giving up despite horrific losses. In just 3 hours of combat, the 49th Fighter Group had shot down probably 60 enemy aircraft, but they'd lost 18 of their own in the process. "Sir." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez came running from the operations tent, clutching a piece of paper. "Flash message from Fleet Intelligence. They're tracking 3 more large formations inbound from Formosa. Total aircraft count is over 300. Morrison felt the exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. 300 more aircraft. His remaining pilots had been flying combat missions for over 3 hours straight, and now they were being asked to go up again against odds of nearly 20 to 1. But what choice did they have? "Get the birds refueled and rearmed," Morrison ordered. "Every aircraft that can fly goes up. Call over to the 475th and see if they can spare any pilots. Call the Navy boys at Lingayen if you have to. We need every gun we can get in the air." The next 4 hours were a blur of desperate combat. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Luzon, only to be met by every available American fighter that could get airborne. P-38s from 3 different fighter groups, P-47 Thunderbolts from the 348th Fighter Group, even a few Navy F-6F Hellcats that had been ferried in from the carriers offshore. Morrison lost count of how many missions he flew that day. His Lightning was refueled and rearmed 3 times, each time with different battle damage hastily patched by the ground crews. His logbook would later show 8 separate combat sorties, but it all blended together in his memory. The constant tension of scanning the sky for enemies, the sudden violence of aerial combat, the sick feeling in his stomach every time another American fighter failed to return from a mission. By late afternoon, the mathematics of attrition were beginning to tell. The Japanese were running out of aircraft faster than they could replace them, while the Americans, despite heavy losses, still had reserves to draw upon. The waves of enemy aircraft grew smaller and less frequent as the day wore on. The final engagement of October 23rd came just before sunset. Morrison was leading a flight of 6 P-38 Sun Patrol over Manila Bay when they encountered the last gasp of Japanese air power, a formation of perhaps 30 aircraft, mostly trainers and obsolete fighters pressed into combat service. It was more massacre than dogfight. The Japanese pilots were clearly inexperienced, probably students from flying schools pressed into service when Japan's veteran pilots had been killed earlier in the day. Morrison's flight destroyed all 30 enemy aircraft without loss, the Japanese planes falling like leaves in a strong wind. As the sun set over Luzon, Morrison landed his P-38 for the final time that day. His aircraft was so shot up that the ground crew would later declare it beyond economical repair. Holes covered every surface, and the left engine was barely turning over. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez met him at the aircraft with the preliminary casualty reports. The numbers were staggering. In 4 days of continuous combat, American pilots had shot down over 1,000 Japanese aircraft. The 49th Fighter Group alone had accounted for 247 confirmed kills. But the cost had been severe. 37 pilots from Morrison's group had been killed or were missing in action. Another 15 were wounded. Of the 48 P-38s that had begun the operation 4 days earlier, only 12 were still flyable. Morrison walked slowly toward the operations tent, past the long line of aircraft being prepared for tomorrow's missions. Assuming there were any tomorrow's missions, intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese had thrown virtually their entire remaining air force at the Philippines invasion, and most of it was now scattered across the jungle floor of Luzon. Inside the operations tent, Major Sullivan was updating the kill board one final time. The chalk marks covered every inch of the blackboard, a testament to 4 days of unrelenting aerial combat. Final tally, sir, Sullivan reported. 247 confirmed kills for the group. Probable total for all American forces in the Philippines. 1,063 enemy aircraft destroyed. Morrison stared at the numbers, trying to process their significance. In just 4 days, American fighter pilots had effectively destroyed Japan's ability to contest the skies over the Philippines. It was a victory of staggering proportions, achieved at enormous cost. Captain Kowalski appeared at Morrison's elbow, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes still bright with the aftermath of combat. Of a thing, Colonel, we really showed those bastards what American pilots can do. Morrison nodded slowly. Yes, we did. But I keep thinking about all the boys who aren't here to see it. He gestured toward the empty cots in the pilot's quarters. Chen, Parks, Williams, Rodriguez, all good men. All good pilots. They did their job, sir, Kowalski said quietly. They kept the Japs from getting through to our boys on the ships. That's what counts. Morrison looked out through the tent flap at the darkening sky over Luzon. Somewhere out there, Japanese pilots who had survived the day's carnage were probably preparing for tomorrow's missions, if there were any aircraft left for them to fly. And somewhere else, American sailors and soldiers were settling in for another night, safe from air attack because of what had happened in the skies above the Philippines. We had the skies, Morrison thought, and they kept coming anyway, until they couldn't anymore. The next morning brought confirmation of what many had suspected. Japan's air offensive against the Philippines was over. Reconnaissance flights over Formosa and Luzon found only scattered aircraft at Japanese airfields. most of them damaged or destroyed. The great aerial armada that had been thrown against the American invasion had been annihilated. But for Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morrison and the surviving pilots of the 49th Fighter Group, October 23, 1944, would remain burned in their memories forever. The day when American fighter pilots had met the largest aerial assault in Pacific War history and turned it back. The day when over 1,000 Japanese aircraft had fallen from the sky above the Philippines. The day they had learned that courage and skill could triumph over overwhelming odds. But that victory always came at a price that could never be fully calculated in numbers on a blackboard. In the months that followed, as American forces pushed inexorably toward Japan itself, the Battle of the Philippine Sea would be remembered as the moment when Japanese air power ceased to be a strategic threat. But for those who had fought in the skies above Luzon on those 4 days in October 1944, it would always be remembered as something else entirely. The day when ordinary men had been asked to do the impossible and had somehow found a way to do it. The kill boards were eventually taken down and stored away. The damaged aircraft were either repaired or scrapped. New pilots arrived to replace the fallen. But the memory of those 4 days remained, a testament to what could be accomplished when brave men were willing to pay the ultimate price for victory. We had the skies, and they kept coming anyway. Until finally, mercifully, they stopped coming at all.